So perhaps some of the biggest news from Games Workshop's latest army building update is that subfactions as we know them may well be a thing of the past. Now there's been a couple of days for the news to cool off, I thought we'd revisit the subject and talk about what it might mean in practice, particularly for some things like special characters and some of the more divergent Space Marine chapters. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking 10th edition rules once more. And I thought I'd make this video as a kind of follow-up to the one on Games Workshop's army construction, that big reaction one to the fairly meaty article they dropped a few days back. Loads of stuff changing, including things like power level going and the force organization chart being gone. But perhaps some of the biggest news was two sub-faction changes. It at least sounds like the vast majority of them might not exist in the same sort of way as we know them, but I feel like in that video I kind of missed a few key aspects of things, and in particular maybe the answers aren't entirely clear cut yet for things like special characters within armies, and particularly for things like the more divergent Space Marine chapters such as Blood Angels, Dark Angels or Black Templars for example. So far the sub-faction changes that Games Workshop have talked about sound to me like the general idea is that you won't get specific rules just literally to represent Ultramarines or Imperial Fists, or say individual crash worlds or night houses on the tabletop, but instead they'll be replacing them with detachment type rules that in theory will be playable for any one of say the Chaos Space Marine Legions or the Tau Seps that you might take in an army. From all that they've talked about in their previews and articles so far, it sounds like the idea is not to tie any rules to either paint colour or lore choices within your army, but instead to offer some rules from these detachment things that kind of fit the flavour of your sub-faction, but aren't exclusively used only by them. I think there's at least some likelihood that say the more divergent Space Marine chapters like Blood Angels and Friends might be an exception to that, and we'll get onto that in a second, but it does seem kind of like the recent Imperial Guard and World Eaters codexes. Different regiments or high fleets or things won't necessarily give you a big impact on the rules, not beyond the specific models that you choose for the army. It does seem that standard datasheets these days don't even have a chapter or high fleet replaceable tag like the old ones did, at least judging by the new termagants. Instead of that, it sounds like they're replacing the sub-faction rules with these things called detachments. These sound like they're the major choices that you're going to be making when you field an army in 10th edition, but it doesn't sound like these are going to be particularly tied to the specific colour that you've painted your army, or specific named faction in the lore, but are more going to be representative of things like army fighting styles that might be common to multiple different armies, like the one that they mentioned, the Space Marine Gladius Strike Force, in theory some sort of balanced Space Marine force that lots of chapters could field. It does sound like these detachments might be written with a certain chapter subtly in mind. Say for example the Gladius they say would be particularly representative of how Ultramarines would like to make war for the most part, and I think it's very likely that we might get say a Phobos heavy infiltration force that might be good for Raven Guard, or perhaps something like a fire support strike force which might be a nice one for representing Imperial Fists. I think that could be pretty interesting to be honest. It means that you could still have armies flavoured in a very say infiltratey or ranged type way, but you could still field armies that are kind of operating out of their comfort zone. Say for example an Ultramarines infiltration force, if there was such a thing. It's not like they won't use Phobos armour like they did in Shadowspear. I think this would fall in really quite nicely with what they did in the Imperial Guard Codex as well. There they had regimental traits that kind of were loosely associated with one of their specific regiments in the lore. Say for example the Death Corps Cult of Sacrifice, except they made it a generic pick that any regiment could take. It wasn't just locked specifically to Death Corps models. At the start of 10th edition, apparently we're just going to be getting one of these detachments for each army. That does kind of imply that sub-factions might well be entirely gone for early 10th, and then you get some of the army diversity added back in a bit as the armies get their codexes. Sounds like the Gladius Strike Force is going to be the generic one for the Space Marines, and then they'll start adding in a bunch of different ones after that in the codexes. They specifically mentioned a first company detachment for the Space Marines. Seems likely that that will be made up of things like Terminators and Veteran units, maybe those being battle line, and he might have restrictions on other things like the less elite units. For the most part, I feel like most of their previews have generally been to that sort of tune. It does sound like it's maybe not going to be an absolute universal rule, as in one of their articles they said that rules will be rarely tied to paint, though I guess that might imply rarely but not never. I guess for certain themed forces it might make a bit more sense. Maybe for the Tau they might have something to represent how the Farside enclaves fight, for example. I'd guess that this sort of thing would have to be few and far between though if they're going to describe it as rare. I feel like if they just made a different formation for every single Space Marine chapter, for example, I feel like that would make it pretty normal, and they couldn't describe it as rare. It's all a bit speculative at the moment though. We probably won't know the full picture until all the codexes are out, and that could be pretty late in 10th. Perhaps one of the things that I found kind of interesting in Warhammer 40k though is that subfactions in game at the moment aren't exactly equal affairs, and some get far more rule support than others, and they might not necessarily treat all of these in the exact same way when moving forward to 10th. Perhaps at the weakest end of subfaction type rules are armies like Death Guard, Thousand Sons and Grey Knights. They have kind of company level subfactions like the Plague Companies. For the most part, I'd say that these are probably like the least meaningful or impactful rules. They don't even get an army-wide trait on top of their regular rules. Instead, they just get a few support options, things like relics, warlord traits, or psychic powers. Then there's the more standard Warhammer 40k subfactions, things like Tau Seps or Eldar Craft Worlds. The usual way is that they get an army trait to represent how they fight in game. Say things like Tau of Bor Concepts, getting rules to represent their experimental weaponry, and then a usual package of support things on top of that, things like a relic, unique warlord trait and stratagem. A bunch of these also have some sort of custom trait building system as well, say for custom Tau Seps or Eldar Craft Worlds. Then with even more support than this are things like the non-divergent Space Marine chapters, like Imperial Fists or Salamanders maybe, and the Chaos Legions that appear in their codex, things like Iron Warriors and Black Legion. These at the moment are kind of in the grey area as to whether or not they're factions in their own right, or whether they just represent a subset of Codex Space Marines or Codex Chaos Marines. They really do have quite a lot of divergent rule support. Rather than just getting one unique stratagem, they usually get something like 6 or 8, plus they often have big tables of warlord traits and relics that you can pick any one of 6 of, rather than just getting one. The Space Marines even have their own supplement codexes with their psychic powers as well. Finally, perhaps most on the line between sub-factions and fully fledged factions are the more divergent Space Marine chapters. I kind of feel like Inari might well fit in with this level for the Eldar as well. I'd consider the more divergent Space Marine chapters to be things like Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Black Templars, Death Watch and Space Wolves, all of the armies that did have their own independent codex in 8th edition, but then were rolled in to be Space Marine sub-factions essentially in 9th. I'd say that they do differ quite meaningfully from the non-divergent Marine chapters, as they just have an enormous amount of unique units available to them, whether it's the Blood Angels, Sanguinary Guard, Death Company and Furioso Dreadnoughts, or the Dark Angels, Ravenwing units and Deathwing Terminators. I'd say that these ones are perhaps the most likely ones to get a different treatment to the rest of the sub-factions in the game, as they're a lot closer to being armies in their own right with their own range of plastic miniatures. I feel like the new system, as they've told us so far, does give us a fair few more questions though. Probably the two biggest questions are how they treat things like sub-faction locked characters, and how they'll treat the more divergent Space Marine chapters, which seem kind of hard to fit in with their detachment system. First up, we've got all of the named characters that are associated with one sub-faction in the game, say for example Harkon Worldclaimer of the Black Legion, Vulcan Hestana of the Salamanders, or Mosrog Scragbat, the Snakebite character. I guess all of these guys will be called epic heroes now as per the new force organisation thing. If, as they're seeming to suggest, that chapter rules aren't going to impact how you select these detachments, it is a bit of a question as to how these guys are going to be treated. I'd say perhaps the biggest question for the sub-faction characters is whether or not Games Workshop are just going to allow you to mix and match any combination of your super faction's heroes within the same army. I feel like it could be quite a weird situation to say have things like Tor Garadon fighting alongside Adrax, Avacatone and Kavan Shrike. It will be pretty weird and perhaps not particularly fluffy. However though, we do already kind of have a precedent for this happening with the recent Astra Militarum Codex. That one basically allows you to take things like Ironhand Strachan in the same list as you can take characters like Ursula Creed. There's nothing really that stops you mixing all the named Guard characters within the same army. I guess you could argue that the Imperial Guard might be a special case, as it's kind of part of their lore that they can form mixed regiments and things, but still this was never something that they could do in the past, and it's interesting that Games Workshop seems to have changed their formats just before 10th edition is coming out. Maybe in practice it might not be quite as bad as it sounds. I feel like Space Marines would perhaps be the most impacted with this, as they've got really quite a lot of chapter unique special characters. I guess Chaos also had a few with models like Lucius the Eternal, Harkon Worldclaimer and Fabius Bile. If they didn't allow you to mix and match all the named special characters, I guess they need some sort of rules commitment to distinguish the various chapters from each other. I feel like a common sense solution would be to say that if you're taking named characters from one chapter, you can't mix with another one if that's what they wanted to go down. Though if they did that, they would still be effectively basically making one chapter stronger than other ones, as it's almost guaranteed that one chapter will get the better special characters than others. Say for example, out of the Space Marine chapters, Ultramarines just have quite a lot more options. If literally everything else that they can field is equal besides the special characters, it might make Ultramarines just flatly superior to the other choices. Seems like both of those situations are a little bit weird in their own way, either weird mixes of lots of characters on the board, or the characters themselves could be a very big incentive to play one army over the other and really favour armies that have several unique ones. Let me know what you think though. Do you reckon they'd go for the one or the other, or some other middle ground system? Otherwise, and perhaps an area that I skimmed over rather too much in the last video, is how they might treat the more divergent Space Marine chapters, things like Blood Angels or Space Wolves perhaps. Again, these guys are kind of sub-factions right now, but also have huge pools of unique units and their own fighting styles, plus they also have their own combat patrol boxes as well. So Games Workshop will be supporting them with their own rules for the combat patrol game presumably. I'd say maybe the biggest question for these guys is whether they'll actually be counted as full-on factions or as sub-factions. I feel like there's at least a reasonable chance that they get elevated back to having their own standalone codexes once more. I guess they only really lost them throughout 9th edition, and they previously had them on the edition or so before that. Again though, I feel like as with the named characters, there's a good chance that you might be creating some weirdness either way. If they didn't get treated as full-on factions, they might just kind of feel like Space Marines Plus, if say you're weighing up playing either a Blood Angels themed force to a Salamanders themed one. Surely the Blood Angels having their own swathe of unique units is probably going to tip the balance to play you that way. At least some of them are going to be useful enough to want to play. Otherwise though, if they do turn out to be full-on factions in their own right, I guess that would mean that they'd get their own detachment at the start of 10th edition, and then their own codexes with different detachments within them, so you might have different ways of playing that army even further. I feel like that could potentially cause its own issues though, if they're still going to have access to basically most of the same units that any standard Space Marines can. I guess it would mean to try and balance them against standard Space Marines, they'd have to have weaker detachments overall. I guess in theory slightly weaker rules to compensate for having load more unit access. At the moment, if they did go down one of these two, as opposed to trying to make them into their detachments of their own right, my guess is they might well become fully fledged factions once more. It doesn't seem too unlikely from that point of view, though again I'm sure Games Workshop will tell us in due course. Overall though, I'd say out of the 10th edition previews, the announcement that sub-factions might well not get their own rule support has got a bit more of a mixed reception compared with some things. I feel like perhaps the biggest criticism is that maybe it's just a bit of a small flavour loss. I think people would just generally be a little bit more excited going by the lore to say be playing an Ultramarines army than say playing a Gladius Strike Force army, even if they still will have their lore and paint applied to them. Not having specific Ultramarines rules barring some named characters might just be a little bit unfortunate. Otherwise, I think for some of the best positives, I think not having rules tied to paint is kind of useful. It means that if you have collected, say, an Imperial Fist army, you're not going to be hamstrung for an entire edition just because their current rule set happens to be very weak. It could be a bit easier for Games Workshop to balance certain units, given that they don't get arbitrarily a lot more powerful in certain ranged chapters or certain melee chapters. And I guess it would certainly help out with their general idea of trying to make Warhammer more accessible, removing a layer of bloated rules. Otherwise, for possible downsides, it might well make divergent chapters or named characters a little bit weird rules-wise, no matter which way they go down with them. And I think potentially could have the idea for making list building just a little bit less interesting maybe, or at least a bit less deep, though I suppose well-balanced detachments could still do fine. Obviously this is still very early days yet, I'm sure a lot of this is probably just a little bit over-analysis of Games Workshop's hints. Not everything is confirmed and we've not had a chance to play 10th, so I'd not really stress too much. I think it is going to be interesting to see how this all unfolds though. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Perhaps the thing I'd be most interested to hear is how you think that they're going to handle things like unique named characters and the more divergent Space Marine chapters. I feel like there's a fair few ways they could go, potentially the ways that I've talked about, but also lots of other middle grounds. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that one linked down in the video description if you'd like to help support the creation of new videos. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.